The magnificent but mysterious Stonehenge. Great cromlechs. The Stonehenge of the North, Callanish, standing stones of antiquity associated with the Celts. Peoples confined to the western edge of Europe. All part of a fanciful but mistaken identity. The cradle of the Celts lies far, far away from the lands they now inhabit. Explorers from the civilized world of the Mediterranean recognized them here in Central Europe, a distinctive people whom the Greeks called Keltoi. But what made them distinctive? A cave in the karst mountains of Bohemia has clues. The discoveries made here record a grisly tale. This was a cult center dating back 2,600 years, the scene of ritual sacrifice. Severed human limbs were found. Mutilated skulls. In all, 40 bodies, mostly women, had been sacrificed. Horses too were slaughtered. The rituals of the scene are matters for the imagination. Archaeologists believe that this was a burial service of a powerful Celtic chief, accompanied on his way to the other world by his wives and slaves. He was buried too with gifts and mementos, the bronze figurine of a bull. A gold armlet, and a necklace of precious ambers. One skull was used as a drinking cup. This, some say, the skull of the chief himself. Everywhere, evidence of human sacrifice. The cave rituals of Bohemia are matched by this piece from Austria, a large bowl supported by a goddess with her entourage. At the head, two warriors hold on to the antlers of a stag. There are naked women. Warriors with conical caps. Many argue it depicts a scene of ritual sacrifice to a Celtic goddess of fertility. The sun was worshipped and is here pulled through the skies by a mystical horse. This animal was to take a prominent place in the story of the Celts. About 3,000 years ago, momentous changes were happening to the east, on the Russian steppes. They were caused by alterations in climate. It was getting drier. Crops were failing, pastures withering. The people of the steppes moved westwards. They and their horses. Known to early Greek writers as the Cimmerians, some moved south to Anatolia, others west to the Hungarian plain and the Danube Valley. The horse, of course, had been domesticated in Europe hundreds of years earlier, but now it was not just a truck animal. These people had mastered the skill of horse riding. For the Celts, the horse became essential in peace, in war, and in religion. Other profound changes came in technology. Europe was gradually moving from the Bronze Age to a new age. Man had discovered iron. Iron cut down forests and cut down men. It became an inexorable part of Celtic life. So here in Central Europe by the 8th century BC, a new society was emerging. Archaeologists of the 19th century first noticed it in Austria, and Hallstatt, a little lakeside village, gave its name to the first period of Celtic development. To those familiar with the Celtic languages, the very name Hallstatt and the neighbouring village Hallein suggest the reason for the area's importance in prehistoric times. It lay not in the village, but in the towering Salzburg Mountains. Archaeologists are still working here. All around them, the secret of the area's importance. Salt. A vital commodity for the preservation of food. The whole area is a labyrinth of mines, salt mines, whose output was prized far above miners' lives. In prehistoric times, salt preserved food. It also preserved the remains of those who mined it. Bits of cloth, a miner's axe, leather, the miner's rucksack, perfectly preserved, as are his other simple possessions. His horn drinking cup, his tasseled cap, scant clothing and mining axes. Conditions here were horrendous. The miners, troglodytes, working, eating, and sleeping in the mines for days on end. Life was cheap. Mining disasters frequent.
Diese große Halle hat mehrere Abbauphasen. Wir können da sehen, dass also über längere Zeit in verschiedener Technik dort abgebaut wurde. Und wir sehen, dass dieses große Bergwerk, man kann sagen, gegen Ende von einer sehr, sehr großen Schlammlawine, einer sogenannten Tagmure, verschüttet wurde. Diese Tagmure hat auch diese Konstruktion, die wir hier sehen, zum Einsturz und zum Zusammenbruch gebracht. Wir haben hier eigentlich einen sehr bedeutenden Fund entdeckt. Dieser Fund ist verdrückt worden von dieser Tagmure. Man kann sehen an der Stellung dieser Stempel, die hier liegen, dass das Gesamtes in einen Hohlraum hineingefallen ist. was bedeutet, dass natürlich diese Konstruktion älter ist als die Tagmure.
Those who worked and died here were slaves. Living on basic necessities, a few cherry pips survived the unknown miner who died here. The slaves who mined the salt from these mountains had their masters. They were buried in style. In 1846, a government director of mining, George Ramsar, discovered their remains. Archaeology owes him a great debt. Here, in what is now common alpine pasture land, he unearthed a huge Iron Age cemetery. Over 1,000 graves were excavated, each meticulously recorded. Some were cremated in the old tradition, and in some graves elaborate bronze containers discovered, this one decorated with solar and duck-like symbols. Others were buried, sometimes in pairs. Some went armed to the other world, but not necessarily for battle. This bronze scabbard with its slender iron sword is vividly decorated. Two men hold between them a spoked wheel, the sun symbol. Then a battle scene. The mounted warriors. You went to the other world with pride. Life in this world was short for men, and particularly for women. This mortality graph shows the incredibly high death rate for females between the ages of 13 and 26. Here's the reason why. A group of children and human embryos from young women who died in childbirth. Buried with them, their simple but precious trinkets. The archaeologist's thirst for knowledge is never assuaged, and digs are a seasonal feature in this part of Austria. Dr. Kurt Zeller heads the dig of this romantically named site, Grave 106. Plundered in prehistory, many things were destroyed or broken, others stolen. A multiple grave. This body was one of 5 crudely cremated. But Grave 106 shows both burial styles side by side. This body was buried. Delicately handled in the field, the remains will be closely analyzed in the labs. Everything points to a male, and a rich one at that. Classical writers described the Celts as fair-haired, tall, and muscular. Many of the finds in the region would endorse that description. But it's dangerous to make too much of this. More important is the abundant evidence of a highly stratified society, dominated by the aristocrats, whose burials were becoming increasingly opulent. The mine owners of the whole of this region were becoming richer and richer as they traded the precious salt southward to the Mediterranean world beyond the Alps. But salt is not all they traded.
Und wenn man sich fragt natürlich, ob es Sklaven oder etwas Ähnliches in der eisenzeitlichen Gesellschaft gibt, so muss man eigentlich fast dazu ja sagen. Es ist zu vermuten, denn in den großen Bergwerken haben sicher nicht die großen Herren gearbeitet, sondern sicher einfache Menschen, möglicherweise zum Teil auch in abhängigen Verhältnissen, sehr stark abhängigen Verhältnissen, die an Sklaverei oder so etwas erinnern. Es stellt sich auch immer wieder die Frage, was diese Häuptlinge, diese mächtigen Häuptlinge, den Griechen und Etruskern gaben, die ihnen Luxusgegenstände ins Land brachten. Die wollten sicher irgendeine Gegengabe haben dafür. Und die Vorstellung, dass Sklaven dabei eine Rolle spielten, ist eine sehr verlockende, auch wenn wir es nicht sicher nachweisen können.
This then was the cradle for the Celtic world. How would it develop? In Central Europe, no strong political organizations existed. There were no great centers of power. That was now changing. Trade routes were opening up, and in prehistoric times, waterways provided the quickest and most effective means of transport. Controlling the waterways meant controlling trade. But with trade and wealth came trouble. Warfare was almost endemic. Guarding the main trade routes, hill forts were appearing with increasing frequency. Set to take maximum advantage of the natural terrain, they were supplemented by banks and ditches and enclosed defenses. Inside, the simple square or rectangular huts of the inhabitants with their thatched roofs. There was no building in stone. The site, par excellence, overlooked the Danube Valley and controlled its trade, the Heuneberg. This hill fort is one of the most excavated sites in Europe. Each season, the archaeologists return. New students, new surveys. But since the Celts built their houses in timber, there are no great ruined buildings to reveal, just the defenses. And within the hill fort, comparatively few artifacts have come to light. All the more care, then, when something is found. Here, just a small piece of amber. This palmet of a Celtic chief was made after the mold was discovered. The pottery provides telltale clues of Mediterranean influences. This has unmistakable Greek designs. There's an almost reverential attitude to the civilizations of the south, even influencing the Heuneberg's defenses. Archaeologists have unearthed a wall of mud-dried bricks, not much use in this part of the world. Built on top of the original stone defenses, Celts are simply copying Greeks. Outside the fort, burial mounds, the final resting places of successive chiefs of the Heuneberg. And among the burial sites, the giant mound, known as the Hommechel. The grandest sight of all, but alas, parts of it had been plundered in antiquity. Associated with such mounds were stone figures standing over them. The male figure is naked, except for his dagger, his talk, and a simple conical cap. The figure, perhaps, of the chief himself. Then 25 years ago, an amateur archaeologist working in this rich farmland area near Stuttgart persuaded the professionals to excavate this mound. Jörg Biel led the team. Their discovery was amazing. A chieftain's tomb, unplundered, came to light. The corpse was adorned by sumptuous pieces. A wide gold bracelet, a magnificently decorated dagger enclosed in fine gold. The chieftain's talk, symbol of power and authority. Worn around the neck, it had been hammered from a single piece of gold. The team were even able to restore the conical cap, made of birch bark. His shoes were adorned by thin gold plaques, immaculately embossed.
Dass es sich hier natürlich um eine sehr stark strukturierte Gesellschaft handelt, ist klar. Wer hier liegt, ist der Boss und wahrscheinlich auch der Boss einer Familie. Ich denke, dass hinter diesem ganzen Erscheinung eine Dynastie steht, also eine Familie.
This was a giant of a man, over 6 feet 2 inches tall. His body was laid out on this bronze couch, at the time padded with animal furs and hemp. Supported by 8 female figures, it is highly decorated. Portrayed on the back, the 4-wheeled burial wagon, and on it, a warrior, possibly depicting the very chief himself. He's accompanied by stylized dancers.
Wenn wir die einzelnen Gegenstände im Grab betrachten, so ist ein ganz wertvoller Gegenstand der vierrädrige Wagen. In vielen Gräbern finden wir diese Wägen, aber der Hochdorfer Wagen ist dadurch besonders, weil er fast vollständig mit verziertem Eisenblech überzogen ist. Wir haben den Wagen ja nachgebaut und können das nun nachempfinden. Der Schmied, der den Wagen gebaut hat, hat 2 Jahre lang daran gearbeitet. Der Wagen besteht aus 1500 Einzelteilen und die Kosten waren teurer als ein Rolls-Royce. Das zeigt Ihnen, wie teuer der Wagen heute und natürlich auch in der damaligen Zeit war und wie kostbar.
This elaborate wagon sported a fine service of bronze dishes. There was to be a great welcoming feast in the other world. 9 places were set. According to the Greeks, 9 were needed for a quorum. 9, the ideal number for a feast. The chief's drinking cup has been recreated. Always the emphasis is on the pleasures that await. There's nothing to suggest warfare. Now fully restored, the great cauldron in the tomb again shows the importance of the drinking and the feasting that lay ahead. 3 lions decorate the rim, creatures unknown to the Celts, and pointing again to the influence of the Mediterranean world. But one of these lions is different, peculiar, not really like a lion.
Aber eines ist sicher, dass einer der 3 griechischen Bronzelöwen verloren gegangen ist, dass die Kelten ihn nachgemacht haben. Sie haben nie einen Löwen gesehen und haben ihr Bestes getan, so ein Tier nachzumachen. Sie haben es nicht nur kopiert, sondern einen neuen Löwen gemacht.
pollen analysis proves that the Hochdorf chief was buried in late summer. He represented a society whose aristocracy enjoyed great wealth in a period of great change. This is modern-day Marseille. In 600 BC, the Greeks established a trading post here. It had major repercussions on Celtic society in Central Europe and helped contribute to the growing wealth of the Celtic aristocrats. Now, more than ever, Greek goods, Greek styles, and in particular wine flowed into the Celtic world. The Greeks named their new port Massalia. Mont Lassois controlled its hinterland, the trade that passed through the Rhone corridor and onto the valley of the Seine. It was typical of the major hill forts of the time, but it was also untypical. In 1953, the royal tomb Vix at the foot of the fort was excavated. Amongst the first things discovered was an enormous wine crater, and with it, a wonderful princely burial. The crater's lid was well preserved, and on it, a statuette of a female. A goddess or princess. The skull was largely intact, and a cast made. Skeleton remains were pieced together, and the archaeologists argued whether it was a male or female body. Prince or princess?
What I found was a very fragmentary human skeleton of a very, very small person without very large muscles, very diminutive in stature, perhaps only about 160 centimeters tall, though relatively short and small. And I also realized another pathological condition that hadn't previously been noted, and that's in addition to sort of bilateral dislocations as a very young person, possibly in birth, of the hips. And so this person was actually showing that I'm pretty certain it's a female, a small female, a lightly constructed female, and one that was unique in the sense that she would have had an unusual gait pattern. There's a sort of waddling walk, but would have been able to walk with both sides affected. That's actually, in this case, beneficial. And she also, her face would have been twisted and her head permanently tilted to one side, ever so slightly perhaps, but certainly noticeable. So she's not a real sort of what you'd immediately think of as a princess.
And certainly no warrior princess. The wheels of her funeral wagon had been removed and left leaning against the timber frame of the tomb. There were the usual personal trinkets and a magnificent gold torque. The Celtic symbol of authority. This is an exquisite piece of gold work, elegant and embellished by small Greek Pegasus figurines. But there are none of the implements of warfare. So what was the source of her power?
There are obviously two ways in which, in pre-state societies, individuals could achieve power, or two primary ways. And one of them would be through the practice of war, that is, a so-called war chief. But the so-called peace chief very often would have created their position or consolidated their authority as the result of other types of skills, including, among other things, this ability to kind of interact with the supernatural world. So warfare then, or the sort of the physical prowess required to be a warrior, was not necessarily a precondition for this type of governing elite status. But the fact that there are no weapons in the burial suggests that she was, on the one hand, she was an individual with considerable political power, but she seems to have been in this peace chief type of category, that is not a warrior chief, presumably a leader at a time when her population had more need of someone who was a religious practitioner.
The most obvious feature of her tomb is that it contains so many items associated with wine and drinking. Beautiful flagons, Greek drinking cups, decorated with scenes of warfare, and the great bronze crater with a capacity of over 250 gallons of wine, a gift, it is thought, from the Greeks, whose military prowess is proudly displayed. And these Gorgon-like gods, snakes and lions, wine then was of great importance.
I think it was the ability of alcoholic beverages to literally transport an individual into another state of consciousness. That was the important thing. I mean, they weren't just partying for recreational purposes. This was pretty clearly a highly ritualized type of behavior that not all individuals in the society would have engaged in, and that elites would have engaged in, and sub-elites, subordinates that were immediately related in a kind of retinue context, in the sort of a warrior retinue.
Wine and the control over it must have contributed to the power of this shaman-like chiefess. But why such a grand burial?
I suspect it was intentional, that this person was being removed, and the objects that may have been associated with her, or with some vestige of her life, were actually, it's intentional, and I think it has a very strong socio-political dimension to it. In a sense, the burial is like a hoard, removed from view, removed from circulation, and that suggests a certain finality. It's the end of something.
Indeed it was. Shortly after her death, Mont Lassois was deserted. Great changes were happening throughout the Celtic world. In Ishmael, the largest of the Aran Islands, off the west coast of Ireland, the men of Aran, true Celts. Still Gaelic speaking, living off the sea and off the land. A landscape, a society, a people that are quintessentially Celtic. But how? When did the Celts get here? Simple questions that have provoked intense debate. Here, as indeed in the whole of Ireland, the archaeology of the early Iron Age is fraught with ambiguities. There are some dramatic sites, like Dunangus, but no one can be sure that this was a Celtic fort. The sea has had a profound influence on all the traditionally Celtic lands of Western Europe, an influence that goes back well before the time of the Celts. The Atlantic seaways brought in trade, brought in people. The Cornish coastline is dotted with clues to explain the attraction of these lands. This is a 19th century mine. Abandoned for 100 years, its rocks are still rich in metals. We know that copper and gold were mined all along the Atlantic coast. Here in Cornwall, the treasure was tin, vital in the Bronze Age. Tin ingots like these were traded the length and breadth of Europe. Stretching from Brittany, through Cornwall, through Wales and Ireland, to Scotland and its many islands, the traditional Celtic lands of today are regarded as remote. Not so in prehistoric times. Up until the 1960s, it was believed that the Celts of Europe invaded these lands, making maximum use of the Atlantic and Irish Sea routes. Likewise, the eastern half of Britain was invaded across the North Sea and the English Channel, taking advantage of front door entry points such as the Thames estuary. Such routes are still important to the commerce of our own age. But was there in the distant past an invasion of the Celts from continental Europe?
I think the whole idea, it's a very popular idea, it's almost widely accepted idea, that there was the coming of the Celts, that there was a people called the Celts who arrived in Britain and Ireland, I don't know, 1,000 years before Christ or something. I think in that sense there was absolutely no coming of the Celts. And if you look at Irish archaeology, for instance, you find Irish archaeologists tying themselves in knots trying to locate the coming of the Celts. There was none.
But if Professor Renfrew is correct, there are things that need explaining.
Fershor, ti dynam her? Hallstatt. Agus ti ishe so go ma yen dulakeka.
He fattas art.
This school on the Isle of Skye is using Scottish Gaelic as its medium of education. It's the oldest spoken language of Europe. So how did it get here?
Halupa.
If you get rid of the idea of there being a major Celtic migration into Britain, that does raise very serious problems about the language, because the language spoken in Britain, and still spoken in parts of it, belongs to what we call the Celtic family of languages, the same languages that were spoken in Gaul and further over in Europe. So how can one explain that? Well, the old idea used to be, of course, waves of population bringing over different sorts of Celtic. But nowadays, I think many of us would see the Celtic language as being a very old language, possibly even going back to the Neolithic period or earlier. From that period onwards, Western Europe was intimately in contact, particularly along the Atlantic seaways from Spain, France, and Britain. There were ships going backwards and forwards, trading, carrying metals, carrying people. And in that context of trade and exchange, I think one can understand how a lingua franca grows up, a language which enables all these disparate people to communicate. That's the context I think we should see Celtic in.
Enter genetic science and a survey of the DNA of the people of Britain.
Well, in the Genetic Atlas project, we're going to build a very detailed genetic map of Britain. And by Britain, I mean Scotland, England, Wales, Cornwall, and Ireland as well, to try and see what influences there have been on the British population and compare those with things we know about from history, like the Vikings, like the Celts, like the Anglo-Saxons, trying to see what impact they had on the makeup of the British population.
Prehistoric specimens are dated, their DNA recorded. Of particular interest, mitochondrial DNA, which can only be inherited from the mother. One mother, nicknamed Hannah, was around 20,000 years ago. Over 30% of Europeans relate to her. This group's ancestral mother goes back 40,000 years. Then this orange group goes back 15,000 years. Of particular interest and related to the coming of farming, this red group around 8,000 years ago. This yellow group related to the recently discovered Iceman of the Alps 13,000 years ago. And finally, a comparatively rare group found in Britain and America. This, then, is the broad grouping of the people of the Isles of Britain. Each and every local inhabitant have the clues to their ancestry in their genes. But people speak languages, and languages can be learnt. So what of Celtic languages? No DNA exists for them.
I believe that those first farmers were already speaking a Proto-Indo-European language out of what we call the Celtic languages developed in those areas. So we're talking, I think, of very complete continuity from the period of Stonehenge right on through the Bronze Age and the Iron Age until the development of those societies, chiefdom societies, those heroic societies, which finally emerge into the light of history when Caesar and other people describe them. The societies which in the 18th century AD were described as Celtic societies, although Caesar never referred to Celts in Britain or in Ireland.
We asked Professor Brian Sykes, the head of Britain's DNA survey, to take a sample from this school at Lampeter in southwest Wales.
Feshgamar, Boridar, good morning. Now, you all know what Boridar and good morning mean. Feshgamar is the same in Scots Gaelic. And the reason I've introduced that is because it's the language, the Gaelic languages, the Celtic languages that define the Celts. And these languages are spoken in northern Scotland, northwest of Scotland, the Outer Hebrides. They were spoken in the Isle of Man. They're spoken, of course, in Ireland, in Wales, of course, and an extinct Celtic language in Cornwall and further south in Brittany. So what we're doing here today, with your help, is to try and see if there's a biological basis for the Celts. Is there such a thing as the Celtic people, biologically? And to do this, we use DNA. DNA which is in every cell of your body and you've inherited from your distant ancestors. So, do you have a Celtic biological tradition as well as a Celtic linguistic one? That's what we're here to find out. Now, DNA is in every cell of your body, and the cells we're going to use for our tests are in the inside of your cheek, and we collect these using this tiny little brush here. So what I'd like you to do, if you will, is just to hold it by the stem and put it inside your mouth and then twiddle it around on each side of your inner cheek, so, like this. And roll it around, picking up cells as you go, and it. All right? And on the other side. Good. And this is picking up cells from your cheeks, and there's plenty of DNA now, with modern technology, to get a complete genetic readout, which is what we'll use for the tests. But we also need to know where your relatives are from, your parents and your grandparents. You have a form in front of you, and if you could just fill that in, let us know so we know exactly where to put you on the genetic map of Wales. Great.
The pupils of this school live 30 miles from one of the great megalithic monuments of Britain, Pentre Ifan. Built by people of the Neolithic age and linked with the early farmers of Western Britain, could its builders be related to the pupils of Lampeter?
And this is what we got from Lampeter. So that's the data. Okay.
Those surveyed at Lampeter are unquestionably of common cultural stock. They're all Welsh-speaking, for example. But the biological test is different. If the Celts are genetically distinct and related to their so-called cultural ancestors in Central Europe, then they would share common genes. Their mitochondrial DNAs should match. This is the ultimate scientific test. No one can argue with the DNA sequence. This sequence is distinctive for each and every one of us, as it is for the pupils of Lampeter. But is there a pattern?
The most striking pattern that we've seen in the genetics has been the contrast between the west side of Britain, and I mean Cornwall, Wales, and the west coast of Scotland, and the Hebrides, the islands off the west coast of Scotland. They're really very different from the picture we're beginning to piece together from the eastern side of Britain. And we're sort of trying to think, well, why is that? That is the most remarkable signal that we're getting so far. And I think it's probably because we're looking at a very ancient pattern, a pattern that's been established on the east side of Britain with the influence from the nearby continent, by which I mean Germany and France, the Low Countries, Denmark, on the east side of Britain, and on the west side, a much more Atlantic influence, people coming up from, initially from Spain and Portugal, up the Atlantic coast of France, Brittany, into Cornwall, and up that side. And they've kind of met, if you like, in Britain. But these would be very, very old patterns, patterns that might have been established, for example, with the megalith builders coming up the Atlantic coast.
The Lampeter sample is in keeping with the general pattern. 34% had an ancestry going back 20,000 years. 25% an ancestry going back to the age of the megalith builders. There was no trace of peoples from the Celts of Central Europe. So the megalith builders of Pentra Ivan, of Callanish, those people who introduced farming to Britain and built their stone monuments, built Stonehenge, they and their predecessors are the true ancestors of the Celtic lands of Britain. Who then are the Celts?
The whole problem of the use of the word Celts is being hotly debated, very hotly debated at the moment. And I think rightly so, because we've used it in a rather sloppy way in the past. You can talk about Celts in terms of language. There is a Celtic language group which was spoken over large parts of Western Europe, no doubt about that. If those who spoke Celtic were Celts, fine. You could define it in terms of art styles and the beliefs that went with the art styles. Again, that would spread over a large part of Western Europe. But if you took the word Celt in the narrow sense of the people who called themselves Celts, then it's far more restricted. The British, for example, were never called Celts. So under that more restricted definition, you can't call a lot of people who otherwise you would believe to be Celts, Celts. There's no simple answer. I think we have used it poorly in the past, but I think we can go on using the word Celt so long as we remember that it's a fuzzy concept. There are cores in it, but it is fuzzy, and therein lies its fascination.
Therein lies its fascination indeed. The Celts remain one of Europe's great enigmas.